Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston, and we're here to discuss what sort of my own sort of understanding or theory of how we got to this point, where what I call the big three, we can call them the financial powers, the state, and technology, have grown to be these, dominant forces throughout our lives. And I think we can say this begins in around 600 years ago. So we can look at the end of the Middle Ages, where we see the beginning of the merchant classes forming. So in the North Sea, we have the Hanseatic League, which extended from London to Novgorod, centered around cities like Lubeck and some of the German principalities. And then you have the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, Florence, Pisa, all of which had mercantile connections. They began the process of building this merchant class elite that develops in Europe. So some of this the Venetians go back to 900 AD. But as far as like an actual force to be reckoned with, you could say the Fourth Crusade, when they hijack it and sack Constantinople. So sometime in the High Middle Ages, this whole development occurs. Now, on paper, the Catholic Church was against things like usury and this sort of commercial society. But in actual practice, groups like the de Medicis were basically running the show behind the scenes. And this is not even a uber Catholic like E. Michael Jones in his book, The Barren Metal, for like the first quarter of the book, talks about how the Catholic Church was basically not enforcing usury laws. Florence could flout them. Savonarola criticized the Catholic Church for that and was in part killed for it. And you also then had the de Medicis becoming the power behind the papacy. And the papacy itself was a football between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines for centuries. We then see within the Catholic world the rise of the banking family, the Fuggers, who financed the Habsburg Empire. The Genoese had a revival of economic prowess by bankrolling the Spanish Empire. Venice began to decline as trade routes no longer passed through Central Asia and the Middle East, but around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa due to the Portuguese. And then the Spanish opened up new markets in the Americas. You also had, and this is where the libertarians come in, the rise of the Spanish scholastics in the 17th century, who gave sort of casuistic, Jesuitical arguments against usury, which Pascal makes fun of in a lot of his writings, in order to justify it. So this complete commercial revolution that takes place begins in Italy. It finances both the Habsburg and Spanish empires, which eventually merge in 1525, around that time, with Charles V, emperor of both. And so you have that. Now in the north, you have the Hanseatic League. The eastern branch dies out with the rise of Muscovy and Sweden. Powerful states edge them out. But in the western branch, you have both in Holland and England, rooted around the wool manufacturing, the beginning of what we would not only call modern commerce, but modern industrialization. We'll get to that a bit later. The first big revolution then was the central bank, which the Dutch invented, and the joint stock company, which the Dutch invented, and the international economy, which the Dutch invented. And this is how basically finance controls us. The central bank issues currency. Basically, there's expected future economic growth that hasn't happened yet, but they assume it will, and that these debts can be paid with the future economic growth. And you just keep telescoping that out down the line. The joint stock company is a means by which you can limit risk to investors by pooling a large amount of investors who contribute small portions to the overall cost. And then eventually what develops within the Anglosphere is a limited liability corporation in the 19th century, which basically just says, we're not responsible for anything, guys. That's someone else's fault. Ultimately, this gets to the point that what we see with Frederick C. Howe in Confessions of a Monopolist, he says, the motive is something for nothing, make the other fellow pay. So this is a brief outline of how the financial structures took over. The state then protected them by externalizing the costs. So they could externalize the costs onto the people because the state, with the force of the sword, backed up the merchants. It did an about face for almost all of prior history. The merchants were seen as kind of like scummy, dodgy people, little better than pimps. And the state heavily regulated it, which, Rothbard's History of Economics indicates he's not happy with that. And of course, the state needed the financing in order to start wars and control the aristocratic families out of the Middle Ages. So we see this beginning with the Kingdom of France at the end of the 100 Years' War. But we'll get to the state a little bit later. So the primary means by which the financial sector controls us is by mortgaging the future. It's basically issuing currency, saying that and then building institutions that are very difficult to hold accountable because they're limited liability. Who owns it? So many people put money into it with the joint stock company. It's difficult to tell who actually owns it and who's actually responsible. And, how do people quantify the future? I mean, one of the things that John Maynard Keynes pointed out was that workers, if they if their wages go down based on, real-time events, they'll organize and they'll strike. But if it's an overall slow whittling away due to inflation, it's this long-term future process, they don't really see it as well. And by projecting all of this into the future, the financial wizards sort of it's like the magician who has one hand in front so that you don't look at the other hand who's pulling the rabbit out of the hat. And, what they do is they get us to look at what's in front of us and then but the hand that we're not watching is doing stuff in the future that we don't see and they're only guessing at. So that's sort of my brief overview of the rise and influence of finance power. Keith.
One thing that's interesting to consider when going over this is to try to trace, like you were doing, the rise of the modern ruling class. Like one analogy I've often used to describe how the power elite or state or ruling class, all these intersecting elites work in modern systems, is to compare them to the pre-modern era. In the pre-modern era, of course, you had the king, who's the equivalent of the state in an older model of society. Then along with that, you had the feudal lords, the aristocrats, who control what was then the means of production, which is agriculture. And then, of course, you had the church, which is the institution that's the arbiter of social values and cultural norms and things like that. And then there's this big question of, well, how did we go from that to what we think of as the ruling class today? And I think the money power issue is really central to this. In these older systems, as you were discussing, there was a lot more control over the exercise of usury, for example. There was a lot more, as you were saying, control over the merchant class. The merchant class was more of a middle class. The banker class was more of a middle class, and it was subordinated to this wider elite. Now, that's not to say that there weren't problems with these traditional elites as well, but what we gradually see is this transitional phase where the merchant class and the banker class eventually replace the older elites and become the new elites and become the new ruling class. And Marxists are familiar with this because they'll talk about the bourgeois revolution that replaced feudalism and things like that. But one thing that the Marxists tend to emphasize that I think is the merely control over productive property. But I think that one thing that's limited in terms of their analysis is control over the money power. That tends to be treated almost as a secondary factor in Marxist economic theory, class theory, and history of economic evolution. But for the modern capitalist class to really develop and become what it is, which is a modern ruling class, before that you had to have the transition to the dominance by the money power, or the banking class, the financial elites, because that's what underpins capitalism. That's really the foundation of it. The lifting of the restrictions on usury is really what made capitalism happen. And then the merchant class had access to all of this capital, and then that allowed the merchant class to grow and become what it is. And of course, as you were saying, there's we've seen that expand to the idea of the modern corporation, which is an institutional entity unto itself. It's sort of like the old feudal manorial systems. That's what I've always called corporations. They're these modern manorial systems, and behind all of that is banking. If we look at the international elites, for example, who were the true elites? Who was the true international ruling class? It's the major banking establishments, some of which have roots that go all the way back to the time period we're discussing now. They have their roots in the rise of the banking and merchant class in the late Middle Ages, Renaissance, early modern period. Like there's always these conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds and people like that. Well, the reason that there's a lot of criticism of that is because of the power that these financial institutions have continued to maintain for centuries. And collectively, we're talking about organizations that even today are trillionaires. Like a lot of people tend to measure wealth in terms of personal assets, or think about, well, who's the richest man in the world, the Fortune 500 corporations, who like they say the richest corporation is Walmart, or the richest man in the world is Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. But by world historical standards, those people are really an upper middle class. The true ruling class, historically and internationally, for centuries, has been this financial establishment that comes out of the exact same time period that we're talking about now. And that's how we got to this modern power elite.
Right. So the next piece is the state, and the state is working in tandem with these financial elites. So at the end of the Middle Ages, the nascent rising states in both France and Spain, and then later on England, because of course England at the end of the Middle Ages is in the midst of the War of the Roses, a brutal civil war which sets them back for quite a while. The state seeks to expand by going to war. Problem is you have to finance that. Prior to that, so first of all, so many conflicts of the medieval era and Renaissance just ended because the king didn't have money to pay the mercenaries. And he wanted to have troops directly under his control rather than feudal service. So at the end of the 100 Years' War, the King of France begins the process of building a standing army, which at the time is very small. I think it's at most 10,000 men. But it's the beginning of a process that will eventually erode and eat away at the aristocratic nobility, because the state can centralize capital. It can also develop more advanced weapon systems. So the use of artillery was used to destroy the castles that led these barons to be basically autonomous throughout much of Europe. So the point is, well, how do you finance that? Well, you go to the merchants, and sure, they'll finance you, but at a price. Now, the modern system that we're dealing with in the Anglosphere begins with the Glorious Revolution. So we had the City of London and we had the Bank of England going back to before the English Civil War. But their complete control over the system occurred after the Glorious Revolution. And so what does this do? Well, the whole idea is having a public debt, right? You want to have a public debt that, in the case of England at the time, the nobility bought into, and then they had a reason to buy into it because they would then get yearly annual dividends. So they have a disincentive to actually pay the debt off because they don't get the annual dividends. But it also ties them closer to the state and to the merchant powers that run the state. So leading up to William of Orange, who's the first post-Stuart King of England, England had a hard time financing wars. The Stuarts lost 2 wars against the Dutch, the Second and Third Anglo-Dutch Wars. Even the parliamentarian forces in the English Civil War had a very difficult time financing the conflict. They had to really pull a lot of strings and go to the limits of finance that was available at the time. And then prior to that, the Tudors had a difficult. They were relatively better financed than the French, but still, what the Tudors could do just pales in what they could do today. We see this again in the American Republic with Hamilton. He also wants a public debt to then tie the landed gentry and other mercantile people to the federal system. And so what that does is it puts an alignment between the state power and the financial power. And if finance controls us primarily by getting us into debt and primarily by manipulating our perceptions of the future, the state controls us by the application of force, either through the police or through the military. Now, in the Anglosphere, because a direct military intervention is generally seen as unpopular, beginning with Oliver Cromwell and the military Puritan dictatorship, it's the police that usually do this kind of work. But, if push comes to shove, they will call in the troops. So like when the Luddites are smashing steam mills, they do call in the troops to make sure the Luddites stop doing that. So the point is, the banks, right? You've got the great working class song, Banks of Marble. They're like, yeah, there's a guard at every door. the state is protecting the banks, but not the worker. They don't have armed guards, working for the state to protect the workers. And that's also part of making the other guy pay. As Frederick C. Howe says, the state grants these monopoly privileges to the banks, to these large corporate enterprises, so they can control us. Now, the interests of the state aren't necessarily always the same interest as those of the merchant class. And we saw them clash throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And in the United States today, with the military-industrial complex being representation of this that Eisenhower warned about, sometimes, they have enough in common now, but you could envision a future in which they have different considerations, because the consideration of the national security state is just stability and order for those who are in charge, right? They want to make money, sure, but that's not necessarily their highest goal, because, they've got a army of killers, so they can just sick on anyone to take them out. And so what happens is that both, and we'll get to technology a bit later, but with finance and technology, all of these costs, which have to be eaten by everyone else, we're forced to eat because the state protects these interests. And they use the force of violence to do so.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the rise of the state parallel to the rise of the money power of the merchant class. Often the beginnings of the modern state are traced to the Treaty of Westphalia, where if you look at the history of statecraft prior to the early modern period, what you see is that the state was often identified as an individual. For example, in the ancient world, the state was always identified with the emperor, or in the period, it was it was a monarch. Often the realm over which a monarch ruled was considered their personal domain, kind of like their property. Of course, those libertarians that are into Hans Hermann Hoppe can explain all of this. But what happens in the early modern period is you start to see the state taking on its own identity as an impersonal entity. The state is not merely associated with an individual. Instead, the state is an entity that has its own life that transcends the lives of individuals. And it's very similar to a modern corporation. A modern business corporation and a modern state are institutions that have a corporate identity that transcends that of the individuals involved. And there's a great deal of impersonalization involved in that. And at the very same time, you see the rise of the state paralleling the rise of the merchant class, the money power. Out of that comes what we think of as the modern state and the modern corporation. And that becomes the foundation of our modern ruling class. I mean, the modern ruling class is the intersection between the state and the corporate world and the financial world. And as far as the military-industrial complex, the development of the state, what made that possible was when the state achieved a monopoly on war. Bill Lind, who's a theoretician of fourth-generation warfare, he talks about this a lot. He talks about how in the ancient and medieval world, all kinds of groups would wage war. You have families waging war, you have businesses waging war, religions waging war. And then in the early modern period, the war becomes the exclusive domain of the state as the state starts to get a monopoly on violence. That's the Westphalian state model. Now, some historians say this was a good thing. For example, Carl Schmitt argued that it had the effect of civilizing war because you started to develop a distinction between civilian combatants and non-combatants. I think that's that can be disputed one way or the other, but many historians believe that the achievement of a monopoly on power by the state was a step forward. Although that in turn created the model for modern states that engage in total war, so there is a problem there. But the military-industrial complex emerges out of the modern state's monopoly over war, and then that becomes intertwined with the money power, with the banking establishment, with the corporate industrial enterprises, And modern America epitomizes all of this. For instance, I once heard a lecture by Robert Scheer, who's a leftist writer, and he said that the United States doesn't just have a military industrial complex, it is a military industrial complex. And if we look at all of our major institutions, we see that they all have their hands in the armaments industries. One thing that Anthony Sutton pointed out is that for international bankers, for arms merchants, for all these kinds of institutions we're discussing, war is an extremely profitable enterprise, and they make profits irrespective of who wins. In fact, I was just discussing this with someone last night. One thing that's interesting right now today is that if we look at the sanctions that are on Russia, supposedly there's all these sanctions on Russia. I mean, by the Western alliance, not by the world as a whole. But what happens? Russia sells its oil to India and turns around, and India turns around and resells it to America and Europe. So it's really like the sanctions aren't even there at all. And we saw that during the Cold War. Anthony Sutton, for example, talked about how you would have the Soviet Union obtaining loans from Western banks and purchasing technology from Western firms and things like that, building military equipment, and then providing it to the North Vietnamese, who were arming the Viet Cong while they're fighting the Americans. So it's like the arms industry and the financial industry behind that, they were profiting from both sides. And even during World War II, you saw the Third Reich purchasing fuel from American oil companies and things of that nature. So we have this modern world now where the money power, the armaments industries, the military industries, the corporations are all part of this kind of transnational ruling class for whom war has become extremely profitable, and the moneyed interests in the top always win, no matter who loses.
Exactly. And so lastly, the third and newest piece of this, I guess you could say leg of the stool, is the sort of technical elite. The rise of industrial civilization, which, and technique, which Ellul says sometime in the 18th, 19th century, there was a critical mass of technique that then gave rise to this autonomous process, which is basically just the relentless drive for maximum efficiency, in this case, efficiency of things like production. And of course, if you don't go along with that, you get left behind. That's sort of the argument. One of the other results of this is what Thorsten Veblen in his theory of business enterprise talks about, the idea of the machine process, where in order for the machine infrastructure to work, you have to have this very fixed, unchanging, rigid structure, which the only changes that are made are those made externally by the engineers who tweak it just to make it a little bit more efficient. Because, right, if everything else is in flux and you can't be sure that the change you're making is the only change that's occurring, then the whole process fails. So it creates this sort of like straitjacket where we all have to fit into this. This is something that Huxley in his 1946 preface to Brave New World and Ivan Illich in his Rivers North of the Future talk about, the idea that we are a cog and that we are a part of a broader system subsumed in this technical elite. Now, how do they maintain control? This is where Aldous Huxley comes in. Obviously, everybody should read Brave New World, but they should also listen to his interview with Mike Wallace. He says you can do, to contrast the Western, quote unquote, democracies of a Cold War with the Soviets, he said, you can do anything with a bayonet but sit on it, right? And of course, the obvious problem with a military dictatorship like the Soviets had is everybody knows who to point the finger at. If you're being oppressed and harassed and corralled, you kind of know who's doing it. You kind of know who to direct your ire at. But like in the American system and in the European system, people really don't know who to point the finger at. They're kind of confused. They're angry. They're lashing out. There's riots in France right now. We had riots in America 3 years ago. But people don't really know where to direct that animus. Whereas like in the Cold War at the end, in the 80s, they knew exactly where to direct the Communist Party. He says that the level of control is going to be far more subtle and therefore insidious. First of all, it's propaganda. So you can go back to Edward Bernays and his work Propaganda, where you create these sort of subtle psychological manipulation techniques, and then you just pump it out 24/7. That's how the Americans got ginned up for World War I. So effective. He's like, hey, let's do it all the time. And let's do it to sell products. And, we have Paul Maslow's American Prosperity, where he says, well, we have this problem called overproduction. We need people to buy stuff they don't need. Otherwise, we'll have to turn off the factories. And so they use propaganda to do that. And then the state uses propaganda to keep people involved in the war machine, as we're seeing right now with the war in Ukraine. The next level is really, really abstract. He talks about, soma as the, quote, drug that's being used in Brave New World. But he argues that there's going to be a pharmacological cocktail that's developed by enterprise and by the technological society to literally change people's brain chemistry so that they will be pliable and controllable. And one of the things that Bertrand Russell points out is the goal of the technological dictatorship is to, by using these kinds of mechanisms, create a population for whom rebellion is as inconceivable as sheep revolting against the practice of eating mutton. To quote C.S. Lewis from The Abolition of Man, man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. What that means is the level of totalitarian control that we've seen over the last 200 years, state power, corporate power, would be absolutely impossible without the modern technological processes, which is how the European colonial powers could conquer such vast swaths of territory, being outnumbered 100,000 to 1. So this, in many regards, is sort of the capstone now of the era we live in, which is ultimately why I don't find the socialist or libertarian narratives terribly compelling anymore, because ultimately they're looking at the problem at a too low level of resolution. You're muted, Keith.
Okay. When we look at the history of colonialism, what we do see something there that's very interesting, which is that we have to wonder, how did Europe manage to expand on the level that it did and conquer the rest of the world? And it's clear that technology was the root of that. I think that a lot of that has to do with geography. The Western Europeans were a seafaring people because of their location. England is an island. Spain and France are on a peninsula. The Dutch are right there on the North Sea. So these were seafaring peoples. They were also people that lived in relatively cold climates, or very cold in some of their cases. So they had to develop a high time preference, in the sense that they had a time preference model in the sense that they had to be very future oriented, and oriented towards developing wealth and things like that over time, because of the fact that when you live in a cold climate, you're more constrained in terms of your environmental conditions, and preparing for winter and things like that becomes a lot more important. So the Europeans, being seafaring people, they were very oriented towards shipbuilding, and they developed over time much better ships that could travel over longer distances and travel more rapidly, and things like that, and were more durable. They also developed better military technology to fight with, and of course the economic development that came out of the rise of the merchant class and all of that, and the wealth that was generated was put into building ships and acquiring weapons and this kind of thing, and that allowed the Europeans to travel longer distances and eventually conquer people all over the world. And that's how we got all of these European colonies, Dutch Indonesia and Britain and Hong Kong and all of these kinds of things. In fact, when you go back and you look at old drawings of European ships and compare them with the ships of other cultures, you see they're much superior. They're almost like spaceships compared to some of the kind of boats that the other cultures had. So the technology was a big part of the development of colonialism. And the technological factors really are, I think, one of the most difficult aspects of modernity, because there's this question of how do you control technology to keep it from getting out of hand and dominating everything. Like we hear a lot of talk today about surveillance. And now we have unprecedented surveillance technology. You can go online and find a picture of your house taken by satellite that just somebody's took from satellite. Everywhere we go, we have these surveillance cameras on us. And, there may be some advantages to that. It may be easier to prevent crime and things like that. But there's also this lowered expectations of privacy and greater ability of authorities to surveil their subject populations and that kind of thing. So, we have to say that a guy like Ted Kaczynski, whatever we think of his crimes, a guy like Ted Kaczynski did have a point about the total domination of technology in modern civilization. But I think what you were saying, the one thing that you said was really interesting was you're talking about how the libertarian analysis and the socialist analysis, the limitations of that. And I've long thought that. I've long thought that a problem with that is that their analytical framework for both of them tends to be more on the ground. Like I was reminded of there's an alleged quote from Queen Elizabeth II, the one that recently passed away, where it may be apocryphal, but she was once allegedly asked, "What do you think of socialism versus capitalism?" And she said, "Well, we're older than both," meaning that she viewed herself as the keeper of a civilization that, and as well as a ruling class that is over and above these kinds of on the ground conflicts. It's like she was saying, yeah, all the little people, they fight over all that stuff, but that's their problem. Workers versus bosses, we're over all of them. And I really think that's true. I think that that's a major flaw in both the Marxist and libertarian interpretation of history, in the sense that the Marxists focus on this class conflict between capitalists and workers. But even at the time, in fact, particularly at the time that Marx was writing, you still have this wider overarching ruling class that you don't really see much discussion of in Marxist writing, the international finance and things like that. And then libertarians are the same way. A lot of libertarians are very critical of central banking and things of that nature. But I think that a lot of them are also somewhat myopic when it comes to the role of the money power and the role of corporations, the role of capital in developing the modern all-encompassing states that they criticize so vehemently. And of course, both of them are very pro-technology as well. Marxists and libertarians are both very pro-technology most of the time. So all of these things, intersect with each other and reinforce each other: technology, the state, and the industrial technological and financial power. So these modern ideologies that critique some of these things, they're really just focused on little bits and pieces of it.
Exactly. And so I'll just sort of briefly sketch how I see all three of these elements working together to not only control the U.S. domestically, but globally. So we'll go back to the financial power. I mean, obviously, the debt crisis, both for the government and the average American, is acute. We've been hearing about this for the last 20 years. That's sort of self-explanatory how it controls. But then you have to deal with the fact, well, what about the control in the workplace? Because, labor organizing, unions, socialism was considered a real threat to because their power base was the factories. Well, or now maybe not so much factories, but the workplace control. They controlled the workplace and they can maximize profits. The easiest, quickest way to maximize profits is to reduce the cost of labor. That's always number one. And two things, there's two confluences here. One, of course, you send the factories overseas. Plus side is you get cheap labor. Downside is China industrializes and tries to take your stuff. So, we could do we'll probably have a repeat of what Sutton talks about with Stalin and the expropriation of capitalist firms. But okay, so you do that. But also, both at home and abroad, you create counter gangs. So you fund other groups which are, quote unquote, we're the real socialists. My classic example of a counter gang is because of Sutton, the Bolsheviks. They were funded by Wall Street to throttle Russian economic development. In the Overman Committee in 1919, 1920, they basically say as much. So like, yeah, we don't want a Russia to develop as a pure economic power. And the way we ensure that won't happen is the Bolsheviks, who are the real socialists, right? And we see this domestically with what we call the social left, what we've heard today called the woke or the bread tube or whatever. None of this has anything to do with working class issues. We have the Whole Foods heat map, which says that diversity, which means non-white, non-men, and dominated workspaces are easy to control. At-risk workplaces are homogenous, which means white and male. So clearly, the immigration and the employment of women does two things. It makes labor cheaper, which is overall how you make profit out of this, but it also makes it easier for them to control the workers. This is an old trick. It goes all the way back to Carthage with the mercenaries, different religions and races and languages. The slaveholders of the Caribbean, they're still all African, but they're from different tribes. And so that's how they ensure control at the level of production. And then they manipulate us with propaganda to buy things we don't need or want, if we were to actually think about it, in order to avoid overproduction. And then they keep us in debt. Okay, that's that. Then the state controls us with propaganda as well. But also, we all basically know the cops are going to show up if something goes down. And if it gets really bad, they're going to call on the National Guard. And if it gets really, really bad, like a civil war, they'll bring in the troops. Now, for most part, within the West, modern West, the troops are deployed outward to the Middle East, to other parts of the world, but they can't be used at home, like we saw with Waco. But that's sort of like, that's sort of like the last resort. Like they would rather control us through these more obscure, abstract ways because it's harder for people to react to. The reason why we've never had another Waco is the government is very afraid that if we did, like the gun owning part of the country would just rise up. They're legit afraid of that. If you watch like, stuff on CNN about like Waco 20 years later, they'll be like, yeah, we didn't do this again because we didn't want the Second American Civil War. And so that's a concern for them. But nonetheless, all of this, of course, is rested on the monopoly of violence the state has because it can force the rest of us to eat the externalities of finance and tech. Tech controls us by making us dependent on the infrastructure. The Unabomber Manifesto, Ted Kaczynski talks about, what if we get to the point where we can't actually decouple because that would be suicide? That's an interesting question to think about. Also, we have the use of the pharmacological angle that Huxley talks about, where people's basically mental states are changed. He argues that like drugs like opium and these other things are bad because they have antisocial consequences. But if you can like have the altered state of consciousness, but allowing people still be able to work and function moderately well in society, that's the goal. Hence, a lot of the over-the-counter drugs that we have today. You also have the telescreen, 1984, right? All these people watching the telescreen to keep them distracted. Netflix kept people happy during the lockdowns. And so, as a very brief overview, it's all of these things working together that create this control matrix that we're living in today, globally, not just in the United States. And the real problem is none of the critics of the system really look at it in this way.
One thing that gets labeled in a derogatory way quite a bit is conspiracy theories. And when you look at a lot of conspiracy theories, you see that whatever silliness may be associated with them, they often have a core kernel of truth, because what do conspiracy theorists typically believe? Well, they believe that there are cabals of shady people manipulating events from behind the scenes. And to that I would say, well, duh, who would disagree with that if they're informed about anything? The problem, I think, with conspiracy theorists is that they tend to overstate their case. They assign too much agency to particular individuals or groups, or they overestimate the degree to which everything is being puppet mastered by a single source. Or sometimes they may bring in more dubious claims like the flat Earth and some of these kinds of ideas on the periphery. But conspiracy theorists have this idea that there is an elite. They do act in their own interest in ways that are often detrimental to the interest of everyone else. They do engage in all sorts of shady maneuverings and shenanigans that impact world events. And this, is a fairly obvious thing when you actually go and you look at how institutions work, and you look at how international relations works, how financial activities take place. We do see this. So the conspiratorial worldview is much more accurate than the view that says, well, elites are just out to do the best they can and have the common good in mind and only want to help people. They may just occasionally make mistakes. You may have people, within institutions that are motivated by that as well. They're simply blunderers, or they try to do the right thing within the constraints they face. But it's also clear that there's a lot of really malevolent people who operate from behind the scenes as well, and operate at the pyramid of institutions. And Friedrich von Hayek, who's a hero to libertarians, he pointed that out. He said that the worst people tend to get to the top because they're the ones that are, first of all, want to be there the most. They're the most motivated to be there. And they're also the ones that are willing to do whatever it takes to get there. They don't care who they stab in the back or betray or harm in the process. So it makes sense that the most aggressive, most ruthless, most predatory people would often come out on top in an institutional setting. And one thing that's interesting as well is that a lot of leftists, they will say, well, the conspiracy analysis is wrong. You need to look at it from a material basis, where it's all about material interest. And I'm like, yeah, but material interests are rooted in self-interest. Like the people who control wealth, property, capital, state, the machinery of state, weapons, they have their own interests, they have their own position of power and influence, but they want to stay there, and they're doing what they need to do to ensure that happens. So there's this tendency today that I see in a lot of media circles, a lot of academic circles, a lot of other institutional circles, to lambaste conspiracy theorists. Isn't it horrible that we have people spreading conspiracy theories on the internet? Or we've got to get this under control. It's in fact, Cass Sunstein, who's a prominent academic attorney, law professor. He's the husband of Samantha Power, who's one of these humanitarian imperialist types in the State Department. But he actually wrote a book on this. Oh, isn't it awful that people are now using the internet to spread conspiracy theories? But my take on this is that what they're afraid of is simply opposition to the power elite developing. And they try to dismiss all criticisms of institutionalized power as mere wild exaggerations, so-called conspiracy theories, that implying there's something sinister to this. And that's not to say everybody who criticizes institutions and criticizes systems of power has not positive motives either. I mean, some of those can also have malevolent motives. But merely pointing out that there is a ruling class, that there is a system of power, that there is a way in which those in institutional authority try to manipulate events in their own favor, merely pointing that out now is considered something that's crossing some sort of line. And interestingly, you see a lot of people from the left, a lot of people on the left who traditionally say, well, we want to attack the ruling class and we're against the man, we stand up for the little people. Some of these people are the most aggressive in attacking opponents of the power elite. And they will say, yeah, we have people spreading disinformation and pseudoscience. Yeah, but that's not really, that's only a side issue. I mean, the populist right, the populist left, these are people who recognize there is a system of institutionalized authority, and that it's not always something positive, and that you have those at the top that are acting in a way that's detrimental to everyone else.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why we see this is because, okay, so on the one hand, okay, give them their due, right? The libertarians put the state under the microscope. The socialists and the left put capitalism under the microscope. Various, what we call technological skeptics, whether they're radical environmentalists on the left, people of somewhat less obvious. I mean, Ted Kaczynski is actually quite critical of the left, but he's also anti-technology. Jacques Ellul doesn't really seem to fit very comfortably anywhere in this context, so he was considered a Christian anarchist. All three of these groups are describing fairly accurately one of the three power structures. The problem is they generally don't cross-pollinate, and they generally don't have this full picture. Now, the people at the top who want to conspiracy theory monger, they want us to be confused about how the system works, because as soon as you can identify the actual power structures, then you can start to do something about it. And they don't want that to happen. Their entire goal is to just be the smoke machine, just generating smoke so that we don't know what's going on. It leads to a kind of magical thinking where Well, things just happen and you don't know why things happen. And so it kind of breaks down your sense of cause and effect. And you just sort of, become helpless and hopeless and just sort of go along with the flow because things just happen, bro. Like, I don't know why they happen. And that's in part because you can't identify the structures of power that are making things happen. Plus, society is so hyper complex that even if you could identify these, which is a challenge all in itself, it makes it difficult to see how they affect you directly. Sometimes it's obvious. You might be an Iraqi villager getting bombed by a predator drone. It's pretty obvious how that affects you, right? You might have the bank foreclose on your house. It's pretty obvious, but otherwise it's not always obvious. And so I think deception and this attempt at obfuscating the true sources of power, I think it's apocryphal, but it's attributed to Voltaire. You can tell who's in power by the people you're not allowed to criticize. And it's these three things you're not really allowed to talk about. Otherwise, you get labeled a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, and I think that the way in which conspiracy theories have now become a topic of vilification has to do with shifting cultural dynamics and power dynamics. It used to be, for example, that if you were on the left, criticizing institutions of authority and things of that nature was considered a positive thing. Nowadays, it's almost a negative. For instance, yesterday I was looking at the social media of one relatively prominent leftist, and he was really lambasting Robert F. Kennedy, and as well as a guy named Duane Gish. Like, if you don't know who Duane Gish is, he's a proponent of Christian creationism. I don't even know if he's still alive. He'd be very old by now if he was. But I remember thinking it when I was seeing this, of all the things there are to attack, why are you attacking a Christian creationist? I mean, that viewpoint has no influence in the academy at all. It's widely ostracized. And Robert F. Kennedy, like, why are you attacking him? I mean, okay, he's a vaccine skeptic, big deal, right? I mean, no, he's not going to keep you from getting a vaccine if you want one. But what I think that the real issue is, it seems like there's this effort to vilify anyone that doesn't fit into what has now become the progressive party line. That is, if you're not completely down with the identity politics, the race, gender, gay, trans identity politics, if you're not a climate fanatic, if you're not a COVID fanatic, if you're not a vaccine fanatic, if you're not an anti-Russian fanatic, then you're somehow out of step with what's considered to be politically in now. So this way of thinking has become the dominant ruling class ideological paradigm that's disseminated through mainstream media 24/7. Almost like it's televangelism or something. And now with the Supreme Court, it's interesting how I grew up in conservative circles, and I remember the Supreme Court being enemy number one. Now, in just a few years now, we've seen that hating on the Supreme Court has become a favorite liberal pastime. Now that the Supreme Court is predominantly Republicans. So all of this seems to me to be a mask for trying to cover up what's really going on. I mean, it's like, if you really want to criticize the power elite, you've got to criticize the elite across the board. You've got to criticize the money power, the technological power, the scientific power, corporate industrial power, military power, state power, institutional power, the power of institutions that actually disseminate ideas and define the cultural norms, which would be the media and the educational system in our own culture. I say those two institutions have sort of replaced the church as the dominant arbiters of social and cultural norms. And it seems like there's a concerted effort often to obscure all of this, to say, to listen to many people from the progressive side of the spectrum talk about this stuff. You would think that the entirety of the ruling class is nothing but the Republican Party, Donald Trump, the fossil fuel industry, and Fox News, and that's the entire power elite. That's a minority faction within the wider ruling class. And then when you start talking about the influence of global financial institutions and all of that, nowadays that's all dismissed as anti-Semitism. It's like, it used to be bashing banks was a progressive thing. So it's interesting to see how the power dynamics have shifted a bit, and then the accompanying rhetoric as well.
Yeah, we have some chat engagement here. This is Nerve AMV Maker for $10 US. Thank you. Limited liability was invented when corporations were effectively agents of the state and their charters could end. Once corporations became a right, LL should have ended or profits been capped. So, what are your thoughts on that, Keith?
Yeah, well, the story behind that is that corporations were originally chartered for specific purposes. You could be issued a corporate charter to, say, build a canal or bridge or something like that. And then the business interests that were the recipients of these state issued charters, they decided they liked having this kind of cozy arrangement with the state and wanted to make it permanent. So they pushed for that, and eventually it happened. In fact, there was a judicial decision back sometime in the early 19th century that more or less declared corporations to be people, the equivalent of persons. So that essentially made corporations immortal. So corporations became immortal entities beyond the individuals involved. And then with limited liability, that means they're also shielded from complete accountability. So what corporations are now are institutions, impersonal institutions that are immortal and have unlimited power, constrained only by the influence of other corporations. In fact, I recently saw where Delaware, the state of Delaware, is actually going to start giving voting rights to corporations, meaning that because the significance of this is that Delaware is a very corporation-friendly state. A lot of anybody in business will tell you if you want to start a national or international corporation, you want to get it incorporated in Delaware because they have the most pro-corporate laws of just about any state. In fact, Biden, that's a big part of Biden's career as a politician from Delaware. This is the kind of stuff he actually represents. These kind of corporate interests that are chartered in Delaware, so where they can get away with all kinds of things they couldn't get away with in other places. So that's become the basis of our modern economy. That's why I say corporations are like feudal manorial systems. They're institutional entities that are immortal with absolute power.
Yeah, there's one other interesting question. Arvon Jindal, hey Todd, for financial structures, which books to look at? Well, I know one good book to look at is no, I can't think of it. Perkins. What is that book that Perkins wrote? That U.S.
Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
That's it. I think. Well, that's a good one. Frederick C. Howe's Confessions of Annapolis is another good one. What books would you recommend, Keith, for understanding the financial structures?
I give a qualified endorsement to The Man from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. There are certain aspects of that I don't know if are solid enough. They're a bit of a reach, but it's a discussion of how the Federal Reserve System was created and the banking institutions behind that. Also, another one is the works of Anthony Sutton, particularly the trilogy. He has a trilogy where he talks about the relationship between Wall Street and the New Deal and Wall Street and the development of the Soviet Union and Wall Street and the Third Reich. And he gets into how international banking has its hands in all of the different, seeming international conflicts that are out there. That's an interesting one as well. There was a book published by the John Birch Society back in the early 70s that, again, I give it a qualified endorsement because I do think it overreaches. But it's called None Dare Call It Conspiracy by a guy named Gary Allen. And it talks about the relationship between the power elite and international institutions. It draws fairly heavily on the work of Anthony Sutton. I think in places that overstates its case and presents everything in as this monolithic conspiracy when I think that's an exaggeration. But it does talk about how the ruling class banking system works. For example, when it comes to taxes, how elites, super elites avoid taxes by putting everything into tax exempt trusts. One illustration of that, there was a speech given some years ago by Caleb Maupin, who's a Marxist, who's a journalist for RT, where he was talking about that. He was talking about the Rockefellers, how they have so much wealth tied up in all of these trusts that are tax exempt foundations. Meaning that they are trillionaires basically, but they don't even have to pay taxes because they don't technically own it. And you also, another thing is to look at the history of the European banking dynasties and how the major international financial institutions we have today have grown out of those, out of the descendants of all of those. So that's, there's a lot of literature about that.
Well, all right, Keith. I think that's all we have for today. What final thoughts do you have for us?
Um, I think that one thing we were talking about earlier is important. A lot of these different movements that criticize the system only criticize certain aspects of it, or are fairly selective in their criticisms. Libertarians tend to be critical of the government, the political government. Socialists are critical of capitalism, the business corporations. Some of the more radical libertarians tend to be more critical of central banking. Of course, the primitivists, some of the green anarchists, they criticize technology. But all of these things intersect with each other. There's an interlocking relationship. Like, of all the models of social analysis that there are, I'm actually much more influenced by elite theory than by either Marxism or some of the economic schools of thought, like Austrian economics and whatever, because elite theory discusses the interlocking relationship between institutions. And you have elite theorists who are on the right and on the left. You can see Wright Mills and William Domhoff on the left, and someone like the Italian elite theorist, or James Burnham or Bertrand Juvenal on the right. But again, I like to make the analogy, as I said earlier in the program, to the medieval world, where the ruling class was the monarchy, the aristocracy, the feudal lords, the papacy, and all of that. We have the equivalent of that in modern societies. And just like these older institutions all had this interlocking relationship with each other against all of us, we have that in the modern world as well. It just assumes a different form.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Thank you, Keith. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast, signing off.